breaking records for all the wrong reasons. That's our rand at the moment. Despite an interest rate hike last week, the currency failing to recover to safer levels. This week has been brutal. Today, I think at one point the rand getting perilously close to 20 rand to the dollar. I think around 19 rand 90 before recovering slightly. Well, let's get the perspective on this from a trusted voice on our economy. Dr Iraj Abedian, Chief Economist at Pan-African Capital Holdings, joins us now. Thank you so much for chatting to us. I'm not sure if you heard what Aisha was saying about the Russian president. There may well be a compromise, which would, I think, save a lot of bother, to put it mildly. We'll get to that in a minute. I want to speak specifically about the rand. What is the lowest level? Did it touch its lowest level to the dollar today? And what was that level?
I think it will just be below 20 rand, as you mentioned. It has been hovering around that over the past few days, almost 7 days. And it's got resistance, as we call it technically, to correct, which means there are, and by correction, I mean coming, let's say, below 90. And so on. And that resistance suggests that in the market there is a growing sense of uncertainty, the lack of belief, lack of confidence, and the fact that the currency is going to be vulnerable to reach 20 and possibly weaker. And that is a very, very unfortunate development.
Is this our new normal, Iraj? Because it seems like we've just dropped to another level in the last few weeks. And we keep thinking, you know, we've seen the rand dip before. If I think of eNCA, for example, that unfortunate incident where we had a finance minister that was not particularly qualified and the rand tanked, but then it did eventually recover. But is this our new normal? Is this what we must expect, that we're going to be touching close to 20 to the dollar, close to 25 to the pound?
Unfortunately, Sally, yes, and the reasons are very different. At that time, during the eNCA saga, it was purely political. The fact that at that time, the president's decision, President Zuma at that time, was completely irrational and chaotic for the economy. At the moment, if we compare it, there are additional factors, more structural and more difficult to deal with. And let me quickly touch on three of them. One is the fact that from a structural point of view, the South African economy's growth has been literally stunted. And there isn't anything in the short term just about anybody can do, because the government, unfortunately, has failed year in, year out to hear the economy, to pay attention to the economy and do what it needs to be done to remove the obstacles to economic growth. And ultimately, unless and until we unlock the growth potential of the South African economy, the currency is going to be under pressure. So on that front, the rand is under pressure. The second one is what we all deal with it every day. Our economy's infrastructure is crumbling. Our energy needs no explanation, and there is no solution in sight, except a lot of additional unnecessary squandering of resources in the name of commissions and groups and ministers and all of that. That's not the way to solve energy problem. And of course, it's not to take away from the fact that the government in the budget introduced some incentive to diversify sources of energy, but that we will not see in the short term. Over the next 2 years, we'll see substantial change, but that's not going to be sufficient to deal with the pressures that are on the rand. And the pressure on the rand is the fact that we cannot produce and we cannot export. And that's a big problem to have. And the third one is what you were touching on, which really relates to a whole lot of geopolitical rookie decisions, rookie errors that the government has made. At a time that South African economy could actually benefit from its neutrality position, it has not stuck to that line. It has compromised that line, and it has compromised it through very, very elementary errors. The president and the cabinet, as of now, they have not been able to explain to the markets what happened to Lady or the Russian ship, was or was it not. And this lack of inability to explain articulately, convincingly, and from a position of authority suggests that the government is compromised. In other words, there isn't, as they call it, the center of policy making for the economy is not holding, and that is where the serious pressure on the rand comes. So when you combine, Sally, these three forces, the currency is being hammered and the country is bleeding.
Where's the rand heading? I mean, where are we likely to be by the end of the year?
Sally, nobody knows, because we don't know when we wake up tomorrow morning what new errors will be made. On all of these issues, the cabinet is quiet. When the markets are uncertain, when there is so much speculation, maybe incorrectly, where do you go to? The government needs to be out. Minister of Finance needs to be on. We haven't heard from him. We don't know if he's around. He doesn't seem to care. He doesn't seem to understand. And very importantly, the Minister of Finance does not seem to even hear the governor of the Reserve Bank, which says we have problems. We have to compensate for the lack of policy making on the macro side. So I think this vacuum of policy response and assurance that the market needs, either from the president or from the Minister of Finance, or even better, in a coherent, consistent, and continuous way, speaking to the market the same way that you and I speak. It should be the president and the Minister of Finance who should come out, address the issues, hear the market, and give them assurance that things are not as bad.
Steady the ship. Interesting you mentioned Reserve Bank Governor. In prepping for this interview, I was chatting to our business editor, and we were looking at the interest rates. When the interest rates were hiked last week, we didn't see the rand strengthening as one would have expected. Which starts one thinking, well, it's not working, so why are we constantly upping the interest rates? But it's very clear the governor's going to continue to do that, he says, because the alternative is unthinkable, which would see sort of Venezuela-style interest rates. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Inflation
Venezuela,
rates,
or
rather,
even
sorry.
more recently, we see the Turkish example. You don't deal with the interest rate in time. Inflation gets out of hand. The economy is not growing for the reasons that I mentioned. And then you will have the horrible combination of what the economists call it a stagflation, meaning inflation is out of hand and growth also not happening. So that is a serious concern. And the Reserve Bank is left to deal with two issues. The fact that inflation is not growing, and the fact that there is no policy clarification or policy reform or structural changes or whatever you wish to call it. The government that should be reigniting growth is absent in action, and the Reserve Bank has to compensate for both.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, telling us like it is, and that's what we need right now. Dr Iraj Abedian, Chief Economist at Pan African Capital Holdings. Stay with